Okay, I'll go ahead and call us to order and declare that we have a quorum of 5 members present. Item C1, consideration, discussion, possible action related to the 2019-20 budget. Dr. Ely.
Thank you, Mr. Harris, members of the board. Sorry. How am I doing? Can you all hear me in the back? Okay, thank you. Mr. President, members of the board, our first item for this afternoon's workshop session has to do with the 2019-2020 budget development process. As you know, we have to adopt the budget at the August meeting and then set a tax rate following the adoption of the budget. We're going to talk with you a little bit about where we are at this point in July. We've done most of the major lifting at this point because of what we were able to accomplish in June with the passing of the compensation plan at that point. So with more information about where we are and the changes to the budget template is Mike Martindale, Deputy Superintendent and CFO. Mr. Martindale.
Thank you, Dr. Ely. Board members, we are going to dive, as Dr. Ely said, we did a lot of heavy lifting last month, so I'm going to jump right into the fun and get going on this one. I'm going to start again with our tax rate with House Bill 3. Again, remember the M&O tax rate was compressed from $1.04 to 97 cents. So I have adjusted down our projected M&O collections. However, from last month, it was 103.4 million. I've adjusted that down to 103.1. When I initially started building our budget, I utilized a 2.5% loss off of our initial projected values provided by the appraisal district. The 5-year historical had us at about a 2.2% loss, so I thought I left a little bit of room. It's tracking closer to a 3% loss on those values that are under review.
I ask one quick question on that. Mm-hmm. When that was changed, everybody within the state was within what?
The highest M&O tax rate was $1.17, and it usually runs between $1 and $1.17. The CSISD tax rate under the former law was $1.04, $1 for maintenance operations and 4 pennies for enrichment. So when compression occurred through House Bill 3, it went to the 93rd percentile. So for us, we got dropped 7 cents from $1.04 to 97 cents.
So regardless of what tax rate you use at, you went to the all school districts went to.
They all got, in year one, they got compressed to 93% of the former law.
Regardless of, okay.
Correct. Yes. So you'll see that range in some places, but it's relative to what they currently have. As Dr. Ely said, it's 93% of whatever their current rate was. A vast majority of districts, though, are at $1.04.
Curiosity, do y'all know what Bryan ISD is?
They were $1.06, and so they went down to 7 cents as well. Isn't that right? Okay. 7 cents or 8 cents?
I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
Oh, we can find that out for you. Sorry.
So all that's, I adjusted our projected M&O collections down, and I'll speak to this a little bit more. Way back months ago when we initially started speaking of the budget, there was a piece where I mentioned current values versus prior year values. House Bill 3 is built off of current values, not the previous year. So actually, if we make adjustment on that projected M&O collection, you automatically recognize that in your state funding and the recapture value. So the funding formulas react immediately as opposed to it still being built on a prior year value. So that's probably a little more than you care to know, but as we tweak that, other numbers move more to compensate for our collection rate or the values we collect. So anyway, adjust it down because there is absolutely a little more loss on values that are under review than we have seen the last 5 years anyway. So going to move down to the appropriations side. I did increase our new personnel by $196,000. That was to pick up 2.5 positions in core content areas at the 7 through 12 campuses. I think 2 are at the middle, half at the high school. Also, an additional special ed position, speech language pathologist. So I had some capacity when I ran the new funding formulas and the new template. So I went back and grabbed those because some of our sections were running larger at our secondary campuses. The big net or return for us when we ran the latest template for House Bill 3 was the dropping of our recapture. Last month we were projecting $1.4 million. With House Bill 3, part of the funding, there were changing in the funding formulas that were added to the calculations that weren't there in previous versions. It has to do with college and career readiness, and we get weighted funding for those folks, so it impacted our recapture values. And that change started being calculated in about a week and a half ago. So it worked out to the positive for us, and so that's where we had some net return or some capacity within our budget from last month. Also added $200,000 to our capital outlay. That was $400,000 last month. Whenever I recognize a little bit of capacity, I try to look and see what I can do with capital outlay. We are spending down deferred maintenance bond money, so we need to make sure we're cognizant of what we're able to put there for Mr. Hall to take care of things. So every chance I have there, I try to balance that with some work on the projected deficit as well. All of that to say is we had and with those adds, we still could reduce last month's projected deficit from 3.84 to 3.4 at this point in time. And really that all came through the change in the funding formulas and us being able to recognize some of those differences in the drop in our recapture. So it went our way this time. The version prior to cost us a little money the other direction. So we try to be a little conservative as people become more familiar with all the implications and the weights and the funding associated with House Bill 3. Questions on this before I move forward? The up at the payroll cost, that is the payroll that accounts for the compensation we approved last month. The 98.4, Riverbend still 850. So all those other numbers remain consistent from last month. Now with that, I've also worked on running projection for the second year of the biennium. So I'm going to lead this with saying, don't fall in love with any of these numbers too much, please. Even the calculation of the tax rate and those types of things are different in the second year of the biennium than the first. So there's still a lot of interpretation and those types of things that are going on. But I wanted to try to give it a run just to give us a feel for what things looked like, to make sure it was within a range that felt manageable for us in the second year. So I boxed those numbers just to kind of show you what I had. The 3% is the enrollment growth that's taken Templeton's latest projections out. The 2.5%, and I apologize, it's not quite lined up, but that's the increase of property value revenue. So the 103.1 million we just spoke about, 2.5% increase on that is the 105.6 million. The second year of the biennium, school districts will be capped at a 2.5% growth on revenue.
And every year forward from then on out, based on House Bill 3.
Correct. And however much more your tax rate grows beyond that influences the compression of your M&O tax rate. So just using 2.5% period as a growth and increased revenue, that would influence our M&O tax rate, that difference there, not quite 0.5 cent. Okay, these are extremely early, and what I can guarantee you is they'll all change between now and when we look at these down the road or next March. But I just wanted to try to give it a first run again to give us an understanding of how this may be working for us. I left all the other revenue indicators the same. That's pretty conservative. You see jumps on the foundation and the available school fund. The foundation movements because there's more kids. The available fund is the second year of the biennium. The per capita being paid is much higher. I understand with that increased revenue, of course, typically in the recapture mechanism, they're going to take more back from us. So you'll see that here in just a minute. I used a 3% growth on payroll. So in essence, I added all our payroll costs, the 95.4 Riverbend, the new positions, and increased that total value by 3%. just to kind of earmark an amount of money for possible compensation next year. The 1% are just increase over prior year budgets. 10% you can see I used for capital outlay, and our recapture moves to 1.7. So it's an increase of 1.3. And if you look at the increase in the foundation available, that's kind of how they mitigate how much wealth per a child. So that's works similar to the old system, not quite the same, but the end result's the same. So that puts us again around the 3.4 mark. So kind of wanted to show the board that. Around the second year also, because I just wanted to see implications of how we've been planning this year for next year. Looked at even beyond that, but still too much to interpret to feel comfortable with trying to project that even close to accurate and sharing that with the group. But
So I'd like to just jump in and reiterate what Mike said. Don't fall in love with these numbers because we really don't know the mechanism they're going to use to cap the revenue and how that's going to look, at the top in the revenue side, or how it's going to impact the appropriations vis-a-vis the recapture payment just yet. So the agency is working very hard, making sure they get year one right, and as they move into making decisions on the second year of the biennium, then we'll know more information. But I appreciate Mike spending the time this month to kind of talk about what it might look like for us, and I think we've got some good conservative estimates in there as to what it might look like for us. I know that we like to look several years out in the future. There's just really no way that we can forecast the impact beyond first 2 years with the information that we have from the agency at this point.
Just a quick question, and I don't want to get down in the weeds too much. Again, I won't fall in love or hate any of these numbers, but just on the payroll cost, a 3% increase, and I'm looking at basically 95.5, and then 850.
Oh, you're asking? Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's just that it's just our right column's a little bit more. It's more than three. It's about $1 million more than 3%.
So add in the 1.785.
All these.
Oh,
and
the 1.7. There you go.
And the 95.
There we go.
I grab all these payroll numbers. So it's our what we did for current, plus we got to add Riverbend, plus the new positions.
There we go.
And rolled 3%. I think that's low over 98.
Just did two of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
On the revenue cap, if you look at it historically, if we look backwards and we had applied a 2.5% cap, would we have hit that cap on revenue growth in most
Prior
years?
to, absolutely, way beyond. Way beyond.
We would have in the most recent iterations of the funding system. If you recall back in the late 2000s, 2010, 2011, we were under the target revenue system. And so at that point, no. Because at that point, the only way we could get additional funds was additional students. But some of the changes that were made in 13 and in 2013, 2015, did allow us to recoup some more revenue here.
And as I understand it, what they're still trying to work out is how that translates into the tax rate our local taxpayers pay.
Yes. So
Correct.
the idea from the legislature is if you have revenue that comes in excess of the 102.5% of the previous year, the additional 2.5%, then that should, at that same tax rate, that should drive your tax rate lower in the future years. So there should be further ongoing compression in the M&O tax rate as it moves throughout the years.
As it moves beyond the 2.5%.
For those districts whose revenue is in excess of that 2.5%. Does that make sense at all?
Absolutely, it
Okay.
does. I'm just thinking about the cost side of it and the cap there. I mean, I guess.
There is no cap on inflation
Right.
and other cost drivers. No, sir.
Okay. We'll see how it goes.
Yes, sir.
I did. This is from last month as well, but I just wanted to circle back around and drop this as well. Of course, we've mentioned the M&O rate. The year that we're wrapping up, the INS tax rate was 33.2 cents. We're anticipating at least a 5 cent drop on that to 28.2. I suspect that when we come with our final proposed budget next month, that will be even a little bit better than that. So we're looking at least a 12 cent drop from current year in our overall tax rate. Questions on that item?
Well, you're showing it again there.
This one? Yeah, same as before. It just gives you some calculations as far as what it will save our taxpayers on an annual basis using a $300,000 valued home. And I do think that, I think we'll come in a little bit better on the INS than what we're showing here. I'd be happy to take any other questions. House Bill 3 has benefited us more than some, not as much as others, but we're much better shape than what we looked like under the old system.
It's a good thing for College Station ISD.
Yeah, I think just based on the numbers where we were, I'll say 3 months ago, just to make sure I'm got the right numbers, is significantly better.
Getting out from under a $14 million recapture payment helps things real fast.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
that's a huge thing, and if that type of approach continues, I think that coupled with, well, a few $100 savings annually, something taxpayers can get behind too. So
Very good.
I think that's a good thing. So, any other questions? Comments, concerns?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Item C2, consideration and discussion related to CSISD's community-based accountability system and work with the Texas Public Accountability Consortium, TPAC. Dr. Ely.
Mr. President, members of the board, I'm very excited for us to be able to spend some time together looking through the evolution of a lot of the real work going on in College Station ISD, especially as it has to do with our work in the community, the world of community-based accountability. As members around this table are aware, this is something that the district has been involved with since really, as Molly will talk about here in a second, our work joining the Texas High Performance Schools Consortium back in 2012. We wanted to spend a little bit of time just really walking through a lot of the things that we have done, the journey that we have been on as a school district, and talk about the work that we're doing and next steps coming up. So we're going to spend a little bit of time. We're going to get you out of your comfort zone and get you out of your chairs and review some of the documents and artifacts along the way. But to not spoil the fun, I'd like to go ahead and throw it over to Mrs. Molly Perry, our Chief Administrative Officer, to talk about our update on community-based accountability. Mrs. Perry.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ely. Good evening, everyone. So as Dr. Ely shared, we've really been thinking a lot about bringing a more comprehensive update to you all regarding our community-based accountability systems. Ms. Nolan's had an opportunity to be very involved this year as part of our community committee, but we felt like this would be a good chance to really bring everyone else up to speed. And as we really ventured into this, we thought a lot about the context that surrounds it, because CBAS does not operate in a vacuum. It really is part of the greater system. And so in preparation for this evening, we developed a histogram of sorts to really document the journey that we've been on over the last several years here in College Station ISD. And so before we move into the presentation, I'd like for you to invite you all to take a few minutes and head over to the wall and take a look at the evolution, the timeline, some of the artifacts and pieces that we have there, and to ensure that everything is well documented for our recording. When you come back, then we will walk through some of the highlights and have a little bit of a discussion about that before we move into the community-based accountability component.
So we don't want to have a discussion over there in front of the board, but we just want you to look at that and reflect on some of the things that we've done. We'll come back over here beyond mic for our conversation. Thank you.
All right.
You better push the green button then if you want to take credit for it.
Thank you so much for taking a little field trip with us. I know there was some questions and a little bit of commentary as we were up at the board that others didn't necessarily have an opportunity to be involved with. And we're going to walk through some of those things, but if you have any initial thoughts after really kind of revisiting the last several years, I'd love to hear them.
Well, I do. One thing I noticed is kind of the common theme running through it is how we have looked at students and education and how we were defining success back on the things that were done before the dash line there. That was done in the green room.
2010, 2011.
Yeah, a long
Yes, sir.
time ago. And how even then, that definition of student success was a little bit broader than traditional state accountability measures, and how we've always tried to hit on that. And that's the touchstone for what CSISD has done. And I know it was before even I got engaged in the process. And how that's kind of a common theme as you move down there all the way, particularly focusing on the learner profile, where it's pretty clear that that's a broad view of student success, and then carried through the whole process. And what I'm guessing we're going to hear about tonight is going to reflect similar themes. So that's one thing that struck me.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I mean, I think if anything that highlights out, it's just a constant push for continuous improvement. And, it's amazing to think. I look back on that first thing when we first joined the board and how we were measuring community-based accountability. And that was a brand new thing in many ways to what we've done in terms of just what we've approved, even just in the last board meeting. And it's been a lot of stuff. We have not been a district just sitting around thinking about things. We've been a district that's really pushed in a lot of ways, and I think you guys should be commended for that. I'd like to take credit for all of it, since it all happened since I've been a board member, but I'm going to go ahead and pass 49% of the credit on to you guys. So, well,
That's very generous.
well done. I mean, it's an amazing amount of stuff.
Thank you. I know many of you are very familiar. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that before you even give your whole spiel, this is one of the reasons that I wanted to get involved even more, was because I knew that this was happening. And I love that our school district is always looking out for all of the students and for looking at the broader picture and challenging the district and challenging the students and the teachers. And I knew about this happening, and I wanted to do more and support you guys even more. So, this is a lot of work. This is exciting work. So, I'm ready to hear your presentation.
Thank you. So to bring out a few of the highlights along the way, in the first section we looked at over on the histogram, really looking at work that happened prior to 2014. Not only our participation in the Texas High Performance Schools Consortium, but our involvement in the creation of that new vision document and the really solid establishment of our core beliefs and commitments, which still ring true today, not only through the Pathway to 25K process that we went through with community members, but also through the process of our district and campus improvement plans. These are components that really are in many ways foundational to the work that we're still doing. We, in 2014, were really beginning that escalation of growth into a larger district, and we recognized the need to bring cohesiveness to our systems. We had been talking a lot about the 3 C's and the 3 R's that you see surrounded there on the model for success on the left: choice, creativity, customization, relevance, rigor, and relationships. And this was really an attempt for us to bring those things together and frame the different initiatives like social emotional supports and the physical supports and the instructional supports in a visual way to help people see the direction. That's also about the same time we started becoming more strategic in bringing groups together. We had our first cohort of leadership CSISD, where we brought community members in and really walked them through the world of College Station ISD. We started our Teacher Leadership Academy and our new Administrator Academy and our coaching crews. And all of those things were attempts to become less site-based and more systemic. And it really was our first step in that direction, and coincided with that very first community-based accountability system when we said, we're about more. And this was well before the A through F piece was a reality, but we knew that we needed to hold ourselves accountable for our community for a much deeper level of success. So as we moved forward with some of these things, I mentioned the path to 25K. We brought folks together to really see, are we on the right path? We know at some point in the future we're expected to grow to 25,000 students, and I think at the time we were about halfway there. So it was a really good opportunity to get feedback and really reflect on the work. And there were a lot of components of that process that ultimately we really did implement, even though we don't necessarily go back and point to it very often. When you review, there were a number of pieces that were resonating with us and continued in our work. We were also becoming involved at the state level with community-based, being one of the first districts in the state to really engage in this work. We came together before TPAC was even thought of, and we're involved with some of the very same districts we're still working with today. We had John Tanner in to talk about what meaningful accountability really is, and subsequently passed a resolution. The board passed a resolution regarding A through F prior to it even becoming a reality at the state level in the subsequent legislative session. So we really were trailblazers in this particular area.
Okay, I'd like to go back real quick. In the board was Trailblazers in this as well. In the bottom right-hand corner, you may have missed that, but some of you made note of it when you were over there by the histogram. But the board's leadership and work in your resolution concerning A through F accountability ratings, and your leadership and taking a stand against that, and knowing that the current state system can't possibly show and reveal what goes on in a classroom every day in school districts across Texas, and just applaud the previous board and this board for your stand on A through F accountability. So I want to make sure that wasn't missed.
So as we pushed forward in the work and became more engaged, at the state level, and we brought in some new perspectives from a leadership stance, we realized that our vision was a little dusty, and we needed to really take a closer look at that. And together with our success team, really completely revised that process, and ultimately landed on what you see here about the development of the whole child and celebrating diversity and the importance of relationships, and honored the past too by talking about success each life, each day, each hour. And so in order to really move towards actualization of this vision, we realized an essential component was going to be a complete redesign of our curriculum. And so using the Understanding by Design model, Dr. Trammell has really led the work there and done phenomenal things in a very short amount of time. Schoology, as our learning management system, was an essential component of not only having a place and a space for that curriculum, but better communication both within the district and with families. And so those things really came out of that vision, along with our profiles. We developed our learner profile first. What is it that we hope to see in terms of the development of characteristics for all of our students as they grow with us here in College Station? And then ultimately, what are the characteristics our educators need to have in order to make that happen? And last but certainly not least, our leadership profile. And we've utilized this not only to reflect on our own practices as leaders, but to select folks for positions positions of leadership and looking for those attributes that we hold as valued and important. So in terms of how all of this relates to community-based accountability, we've been working very closely for the last 2.5 years. We're on year 3 now with TPAC, the Texas Public Accountability Consortium. And through that process, we've developed the 7 pillars. We have been very engaged alongside the Future Ready Superintendents Leadership Network, which has challenged our thinking and our perspective, and looking at what other districts are doing and how we can bring those things in a way that works for us here in College Station. So that engagement across the state has been a really essential part of this process as well, and we'll delve more into that in just a little bit. So in thinking about the history, I think it's also important to understand the context outside of our district with accountability. There's certainly a lot of perceptions and maybe even misconceptions about what accountability systems are and are not. So we're going to take just a few minutes to talk through those and then shift into a better understanding of what community-based really is about. So a very, very brief history of test-based accountability. We saw in the mid-'60s really the first national effort to bring accountability to the forefront and ensure that all states were required to have high standards for their students. This was truly an outcrop of the civil rights movement and equity for our students across the nation. But there really wasn't anything like what we see today in terms of widespread standardized testing. Texas actually led the way there in the early mid-'90s with implementing a test-based system where students had to perform at certain levels in order for schools and districts to achieve at the levels that were set as expected. Things really ramped up nationally in 2001 with No Child Left Behind, which ultimately evolved into the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, in 2015. And then ultimately Texas one-upped them in 2017 with legislation to grade schools and districts using an A through F letter system. That system, as you all know, went into effect in 2018 for districts, and then this year both campuses and districts will be rated on all of the 3 domains and overall using an A through F letter grade. So federally, ESSA is our current standard in terms of policy, and there are a number of requirements. We do have to have academic standards in Texas. That's the TEAGS. We have to have an accountability system. We have to have a measure of student performance that's standardized. Sometimes you'll hear people say, we just need to get rid of the STAR. Well, we do have to have some sort of standardized test in order to be compliant with federal law. And in the ESSA process, when schools are low performing, there have to be things in place to turn those around. We have to include things like English language proficiency and non-academic measures. In Texas, that's our college career readiness component, and another academic. So that's how social studies comes into play for us in Texas. And then finally, our districts and high schools have to include graduation rates in those systems. So that's what ESSA requires. Here in Texas, since the 85th legislature, we have the A through F system, which is based on 3 domains: student achievement, school progress, and closing the gaps. The domains are all rated. However, the overall score is based on either student achievement or school progress, whichever's higher, and then 30% on closing the gaps. But really what that looks like is a very heavily weighted system on the STAR. For districts and high schools, it looks like this in terms of STAR, college career, military readiness, graduation. For elementaries, they don't have all of those things, and so it really is... You're
talking about domain 1 right now?
Yes, it really is STAR. Similarly, for domain 2, for high schools and districts, we'd look at STAR and CCMR, elementaries and middle school STAR only, and then same thing with closing the gaps. We would not have a CCMR rate or grad rate. They would only be rated on STAR and English language proficiency for elementary. So what did this look like last year? We know that here in College Station ISD, our overall rating was an 89. And when we scatter plot how districts did across the state in terms of their letter grade on the left and the percentage of students who are classified as economically disadvantaged based on free and reduced lunch status, you'll notice that there is a pretty tight line of fit, especially for those districts who have lower rates of students who are economically disadvantaged. So here in College Station, we're right about 35%. And so, you would expect that we would fall right about where we do, right? The other thing that I think is really telling about this is that those districts who have very low rates of poverty are basically guaranteed to get a B. And as you get into higher and higher rates of poverty, the scatter is much greater in terms of how districts performed. So I think this is a helpful visual to frame the conversation moving forward about standardized tests and the impact of poverty. So we're going to take just a few minutes. Some of us around the table are very familiarized with standardized testing and procedures, and some of us are not. And even those that are, I think this is a nice sort of way to remember what standardized testing is really about and what it's designed for. So if you'll give us just a few minutes, this should work for us.
The first standardized tests that we know of were administered in China over 2,000 years ago, during the Han Dynasty. Chinese officials used them to determine aptitude for various government posts. The subject matter included philosophy, farming, and even military tactics. Standardized tests continued to be used around the world for the next 2 millennia. And today, they're used for everything from evaluating stair climbs for firefighters in France to language examinations for diplomats in Canada to students in schools. Some standardized tests measure scores only in relation to the results of other test takers. Others measure performances on how well test takers meet predetermined criteria. So, the stair climb for the firefighter could be measured by comparing the time of the climb to that of all other firefighters. This might be expressed in what many call a bell curve. Or it could be evaluated with reference to set criteria, such as carrying a certain amount of weight, a certain distance, up a certain number of stairs. Similarly, the diplomat might be measured against other test-taking diplomats, or against a set of fixed criteria which demonstrate different levels of language proficiency. And all of these results can be expressed using something called a percentile. If a diplomat is in the 70th percentile, 70% of test takers scored below her. If she scored in the 30th percentile, 70% of test takers scored above her. Although standardized tests are sometimes controversial, they're simply a tool. As a thought experiment, think of a standardized test as a ruler. A ruler's usefulness depends on 2 things. First, the job we ask it to do. Our ruler can't measure the temperature outside or how loud someone's singing. Second, the ruler's usefulness depends on its design. Say you need to measure the circumference of an orange. Our ruler measures length, which is the right quantity, but it hasn't been designed with the flexibility required for the task at hand. So, if standardized tests are given the wrong job or aren't designed properly, they may end up measuring the wrong things. In the case of schools, students with test anxiety may have trouble performing their best on a standardized test, not because they don't know the answers, but because they're feeling too nervous to share what they've learned. Students with reading challenges may struggle with the wording of a math problem, so their test results may better reflect their literacy rather than numeracy skills. And students who are confused by examples on tests that contain unfamiliar cultural references may do poorly, telling us more about the test taker's cultural familiarity than their academic learning. In these cases, the tests may need to be designed differently. Standardized tests can also have a hard time measuring abstract characteristics or skills, such as creativity, critical thinking, and collaboration. If we design a test poorly or ask it to do the wrong job, or a job it's not very good at, the results may not be reliable or valid. Reliability and validity are 2 critical ideas for understanding standardized tests. To understand the difference between them, we can use the metaphor of two broken thermometers. An unreliable thermometer gives you a different reading each time you take your temperature, and the reliable but invalid thermometer is consistently 10 degrees too hot. Validity also depends on accurate interpretations of results. If people say the results of a test mean something they don't, that test may have a validity problem. Just as we wouldn't expect a ruler to tell us how much an elephant weighs or what it had for breakfast, we can't expect standardized tests alone to reliably tell us how smart someone is, how diplomats will handle a tough situation, or how brave a firefighter might turn out to be. So, standardized tests may help us learn a little about a lot of people in a short time, but they usually can't tell us a lot about a single person. Many social scientists worry about test scores resulting in sweeping and often negative changes for test takers, sometimes with long-term life consequences. We can't blame the tests, though. It's up to us to use the right tests for the right jobs and to interpret results appropriately. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, we highly recommend a best-selling book called The End of Average by Harvard professor Todd.
So I love that video because I think it provides a lot of information in a short amount of time to really help us reframe this idea of standardized tests, because I think there's certainly a misconception out there about the tests that are utilized to measure our student performance, the STAR, and I think that there's often a belief that those are tests that are designed at that set criteria rather than measuring students relative to other students' performance. And so we know that you can really accomplish an accountability system using standardized tests, because you can measure a little about a lot of people relatively easy. I say relatively because certainly the process is cumbersome statewide, but it really doesn't give us a lot of great information about how students are doing, not only compared to the standards in the curriculum, but the timing is also a challenge, because we don't know how a student fared until often June, when we are moving to the next grade level and the student is no longer with that teacher. We really need better measures to look at quality of learning and things that are going to provide us more instant feedback. So as we've talked about, we're moving towards that with things like MAP. So in thinking about standardized assessments and accountability systems, we've really engaged in a lot of thinking about this idea of what is true accountability. Is it the performance on a standardized test that a student takes once a year? Or is it really something that provides us with good information to make meaningful decisions? You know, the idea of starting with what we want to accomplish is very different than our very first iteration of community-based accountability. When we first dipped our toes in back in 2013-14, we sat around a table and thought, we want to do something different. What information do we know? What can we report on? What can we share? You know, at the time, that was fairly groundbreaking. Nobody had really done that. But when we flipped the narrative and asked ourselves, what do we want to accomplish? Sometimes we don't already have a measure for that. And that's okay, because that is what drives change. And ultimately, that's the purpose of this system, is to drive that improvement in a way that always benefits students. As I mentioned, our involvement with Future Ready Superintendent's Leadership Academy has been a big piece of this idea that we don't know what the future holds for our students. We don't know what jobs will exist by the time many of our students enter the workforce, but we do know that there are certain skills that they'll need to be able to transfer to any number of careers that they might be with. And then finally, we want to make sure this is not a narrow system that's not just looking at a few ways that our students are smart, but really being more comprehensive. And what we mean by that is this idea of multiple intelligences. Now, there's lots of different theorists out there. I think this is a pretty comprehensive one and a nice visual. So if you'll just take a second to look around the visual of the different types of intelligence. Reflect on maybe you or even your own child or children in the ways that you see strengths and maybe the ways that are more of a weakness. Do you know anyone that is strong in all of those areas?
Besides Mr. Schaefer?
It's always outliers.
Yeah.
So it's typical that you're going to see a profile with peaks and valleys. If you were to map out strengths and weaknesses, which we could do an exercise, but ultimately you're going to see things that are strong and things that are not so strong for everyone, because there are lots of other ways that people can be smart aside from the kinds of verbal, linguistic, or mathematical skills that are typically assessed on standardized tests. Certainly thinking about interpersonal skills, not something that you would be able to measure on a STAR test, right? Not something you would be able to measure on any multiple choice kinds of test. Some of these things are things that would be more performance-based, like musical abilities or spatial. Right? If you're packing the car on a long trip, that might be a skill that you would have to perform. So in thinking about the different types of intelligence and a system that can better help us to look at students' strengths, does the current system really measure the strengths and needs of schools and districts? It's rhetorical.
Tends to be.
So if not that, then what, right? And we feel very, very strongly and committed to this idea that the alternative is a community-based system. It's a system that's designed around the values and the desires and the wishes of local communities. And while there may be similarities across different areas, every community has their own unique members and values, and these systems can really, truly capture and reflect those things. Because they really are about those stakeholders coming together and creating something that's more meaningful and localized, and it goes well beyond those standardized tests to include every child, educator, and community. So we have a few examples. We like pictures. We're going to start with some of our SkillsUSA students who went all the way to nationals. And we want to highlight just a few of the districts that are involved in the work and some of the things that represent different ways kids are smart that these districts are doing that are pretty phenomenal and are not part of our state assessment and accountability system. So in Burkburnett, they were actually just acknowledged nationally for their work in project-based learning, and they're doing lots of innovative things there. Much smaller district than College Station. Clear Creek, may know Clear Creek ISD is down with NASA in their backyard. They're building planes, much larger than us here in College Station as well. Corsicana, right at 45, has a heavy emphasis on coding all the way down to the early grades. Roscoe Collegiate, if you don't know about Roscoe, they have got a phenomenal thing going on up there with their drone project and preparing students in a very, very small rural district.
Outside of Abilene,
Thank you.
west of Abilene,
And Godley. Anybody know where Godley is?
south of Fort Worth.
They have good fish on Friday night.
All right. They have a great health science program there in Godley. And you'll see on the right the list of all of the current participants in our TPAC consortium. So you can see the name of the district, the region, meaning the regional service center in the state, and then their enrollment. So Northside wins the prize for our largest district with an enrollment of over 105,000, and then Roscoe Collegiate wins our smallest district with 541, and everything in between. So we started in our involvement at its very beginning in spring of 2017, and the members are very diverse, and you can see here a visual. Other than far west Texas, we've got pretty good representation, especially along that I-35 corridor, all around the state of different sizes, locations, geographic makeup, percentage of students who are considered to be economically disadvantaged. So it's a really great group of folks that are committed to the work, that bring a lot of diversity of thought. One of the primary accomplishments, I would say, of the group is coalescing around this idea of 7 pillars, because in order to design a system, we've got to have some commonalities, right, in language and expectation. The goal is to ultimately have a system of accreditation for community-based accountability. And in order to do that, we do have to have some areas of consistency in other areas where it is truly very locally defined. And so those 7 pillars are listed here. And ultimately, anything that we do as a school system could really be classified under one of these pillars. Sometimes, maybe even might be some question about which pillar. As we went through the work, we realized, well, maybe that's here, or maybe it's there. Uh-oh.
Dave.
Thank you. So one of the things you'll find at your place is a little bit of a visual that came out of the work with TPAC. On the back, you'll find a comparison of our state accountability system versus community-based, to give an even better idea of how those systems might be a little bit alike, or might be different, or things that are just not measured at all in the state system, as well as a little more information about TPAC. So I just wanted to make sure you guys had a copy of that. This is something that, as we've brought community members in to work with us, we share with them as well, because it's a nice summary of those systems. So in thinking a little bit more about the structure, with the TPAC group, we really felt that every district that really engaged in the work needed to have some common components. So we have our pillars. We've talked a lot about our pillars over the months that we've shared information with you. Those are those categories. Then we move into key questions, right? Because we're starting with, what do we want to know? What are our interests, our concerns, our areas of focus? And for each of those pillars, we develop key questions to then determine what kinds of evidence are going to be needed to answer those questions. You will also find at your place a list of the key questions by pillar, so you can get a better idea of really where we've landed with that. And I'll show some examples on the large presentation here in a few moments as well. As we started working with our group, this was really a huge focus this particular year. In the fall, we worked really diligently to initially try to identify key questions for, was it 4? Yeah, 4 pillars. And then we got really ambitious and decided just to keep rolling with it and flesh out all 7 pillars. Our compadres in TPAC think we're a little bit crazy for doing that, but we think that we are just ahead of the curve. So those key questions are really critical, and they're going to vary by district, because that's where the community input and the values of the community really come out in terms of what's important. The system response is really about the capacity of our systems. If we have a question that asks about whether or not our school cultures are fostering partnerships with families, then the question becomes, well, what is our system doing to ensure that that's possible? If we want to make sure that every student graduates, what do we have in place with our system to support that to actually happen? So the evidence is ultimately what is happening. when we look at the key questions and we ask them, we need to know what are the metrics, what are the indicators, and ultimately once we have that information, we'll contextualize it into findings. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it on the right track? Is it not? And those findings will help us to know what are the strengths and then what are the areas of improvement that may need to be part of our plan, our district improvement plan or campus improvement plans. So we've talked a lot about systems, and I think this is a really appropriate quote because every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. So if we don't have those system responses in place, then we won't be able to move forward. And I think that's really a key aspect of this understanding. This visual, I think, really brought a lot of clarity for us as we worked through the process as well. So we'll kind of talk through it. This idea of an accountability engine, meaning it's driving change, really, again, starts with those key questions. It leads to looking at what is our system doing to respond to these things. Do we have capacity in place? Do we need to change our systems in order to push us forward? And then ultimately, what's the evidence, the metrics, the indicators? And then once we've looked at that, what decisions might we make to do things either differently or continue, or maybe even to abandon some things in order to ultimately move us towards success? So the dashed line is really indicative of what is really outward facing versus what's more of internal processes. So above the line, those key questions are very forward facing to the community. What are we asking? We're getting community feedback on what those questions are. Those can evolve over time. And it's what the world really sees in terms of the different signals for what we're doing and the pillars and how those are developed. Internally, while still transparent and available, the things we're doing are responding and looking at the evidence and making those decisions. So ultimately, the goal of this system is to drive change, because if it's not, then really it's not useful to us.
And then as we get the type of system that we all aspire to, it changes over time. You look over the 5 years that's depicted over the wall. We've changed over time, and our expectations, our community expectations, our needs are going to change. And so ultimately those key questions will continue to be looked at and will evolve over time to basically where the community is and where the school district is at that particular moment.
So mentioned a little bit about the evolution, certainly not all the way back to the first version, but when we started this transformation work after being with TPAC for about a year, we got together with a group of administrators because we weren't ready to fail publicly. Just to be quite honest, we knew this was going to be a little bit messy. And so we wrestled with the idea of creating key questions. And we learned that was a really hard process because we are not accustomed to asking questions that we don't already know the answers to. And really that question was, to whom are we accountable and for what? And how do we know if our professional learning is what it needs to be and if our quality of staff is where we would like for it to be? And so we really focused in on those questions. Once we played around with that, we felt a little more confident in moving forward. So we got a committee together and began the work mid-fall of 2018. And as I mentioned, really focused in on those key questions. And then in the spring, we actually expanded our group. We had a whole nother set of orientations to try to bring in some more diversity of thought and push forward in looking at, what are those evidences perhaps going to look like for these different key questions.
Just a point of clarification, the work in 2018 was administrative, and then the committee that we talked about was a community committee, and we put the all call out, and we got great response, different parents and community members, and Ms. Nolan was a part of that process as well. And when you ask questions of yourself, of administrators, is one thing, but when you get the diversity of thought and the expectations of business owners, community leaders, and parents in the room, it really just adds to the richness of the conversation. And what we were able to develop both in the fall and the development of the key questions and then the evidences in the spring was would not have been possible without the tremendous dedication of those who joined us. And certainly thank you to you, Mrs. Nolan, for being a part of that.
Absolutely. So as an example, you all have those in front of you. I pulled just the professional learning quality staff. So you can see they all really start with that same question, to what degree? Because this is not a yes/no kind of question. It really is, where are we on this continuum? Because you don't either have or don't have high quality staff, but perhaps they're pretty good and they could be better, or maybe they're not as good. And so really all of those questions are aligned in that way, because we're not looking for a binary kind of answer, and we want to be more qualitative while at the same time providing good quantitative information to help us answer these questions along the way.
I think one of the things that's interesting about this, if you look at the first one, to what degree do instructional staff reflect the high quality expectations of the CSISD educator profile? When we created this key question, we didn't have a CSISD educator profile. It really highlighted for us is we need to know what types of qualities our educators have, and we need to have a discussion internally about what it is that we value. So even before we fully implemented this system, it's already started to drive change that you saw over there on the board.
That's a great point. There were a number of pieces along the way where committee members would say, well, how do we do that? Well, we don't, but we will. How do we get that survey? We're going to figure it out. So the process was very, very, very different than the initial version 1.0. Here's a sample of what the work is looking like to this point. Same pillar there with professional learning and quality staff. So you can see the function on the left and the first three key questions. The system response, we talked a little bit about what is the capacity of our system. Do we have things in place to retain high quality staff? Do we have systems in place to attract high quality staff? And then ultimately, what evidences would we accept as information that answers that question? And then on the plan, what do we need to do to either get that information or to get systems in place? And so it's really sort of a note to ourselves. We need to analyze our teacher evaluation data in a different way than just gathering it. We need to administer a survey so that we can know what is the perception of our students and our parents and our administrators regarding teacher quality. So in thinking about our next steps, because we are certainly not done with this process, it's iterative and will be ongoing. We find great value in working with our cohort in TPAC. In the year 3, we shifted away from focusing in on things like accreditation and board training as our contribution, and moved towards a group of districts who are in similar places with the work, which has been very valuable because we've been able to share ideas and learn from each other. In fact, the histogram you saw tonight, while it's not part of one of these districts, we did steal that idea from San Angelo when we were working with them. They are part of TPAC as well, so to give credit where credit is due there. We were also engaged not just with the group, but in outreach and sharing this information beyond. We're scheduled to give a presentation at the upcoming TASA-TASB conference, not only for attendees, but with our 5-district group, we'll be offering a board training and orientation where board members from our respective districts can come together and have conversations about the work in the districts, because the support of the board is absolutely essential to this work pushing forward and happening. We have proposals in for the annual state assessment conference in November to work alongside Burkburnett, and then at TASA Midwinter as well. So we're excited to be able to share our work with others and continue to learn from others at that state level. Internally, we know that we have got to implement a survey instrument. You'll notice many of the key questions do involve perception data. And while it won't be solely based on that, it will be an important component. And so we're getting a group together to look at options and think about timing. And ultimately, this year is going to be one of gathering lots of baseline data so that we'll, at this time next year, hopefully be able to provide you all with a lot more information about really what we're finding and what our system responses might be as a result with CBAS. And with that, I would love to answer any questions or discuss your.
Mr. Glenwinkle wanted to point out there's a microphone on there just to make sure that everybody's keyed in to speak into the microphone. So
Very nice. Thank you very much for that report. Questions, comments?
I have a question first. Is TPAC growing? Are more districts being added on, joining?
go ahead.
Yeah, there have been more districts grow. There have been some drop off. We've noticed that sometimes it depends on district leadership. If superintendent's very involved in the process and perhaps moves to a different district, it may not be a priority for that district after, or at least in the immediate wake of that transition in leadership. But there has been growth, and we are looking to continue to grow.
For year one, we had 44, and now we're at 51. So ebb and flow.
I do want to make a comment. I think it ties into Mr. Tanner's presentations to us and how the test is important, but when you look at the methodology they use to create the test, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's something I'll just use. I don't know if these are the exact numbers, but let's say you create a test, and when you design it, it's designed with all the sample questions and reams of research they have, but only 10% of people can get A's. Well, it's silly to turn around and then expect more than 10% to get A's. And the flip side of that's also true, where they say, well, we're going to design a test so that every year 10% get F's. Well, then we turn around and act shocked. What are we doing? 10% of people got F's. I mean, but how they have those things so dialed in, and they're done in such a, I forget the term he used. You might remember it. I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot about standardized
Distribution.
What is it?
Forced distribution.
Right. Okay, so he did it with us by height, and you all remember that. Well, I mean, it's kind of silly then if that's the only measure you take. I think it's pretty clear there is a place for those. I think, well, one, federal law requires it, so it doesn't really matter what we all think. Let's do that. But there's a whole lot more to it. And I think it's important that we're taking this step, and I do applaud the effort. And it's interesting how much similarity I see in this as a parent who looks at developing their child as a learner, and how you try to have all these different things. I don't want them to be just good in the classroom, but I want them to make good grades. And I want them to participate in other activities, whether it's music, sports, whatever it is, but as many as possible so that they can develop all these different skill sets. And I guess you could get into the science of the neural pathways and all that. I'll leave that to others. But I really do like that we have all of these different pillars, is the terminology we're using. So that we get a better idea of what are the key things we're doing and trying to develop, and then making sure we hit them all so that we don't just have kids that are good at one thing or a district that's good at one thing, whether it's being very fiscally responsible and not spending any money. I mean, we've all been to those trainings where we've heard that, where they would not approve any bond package for anything. Well, okay, there are times for that, but is that necessarily the best thing when you start looking at how that then plays through your factors? And that's just one example, because to me they all are like that, and they're all interrelated. And I appreciate the work to be intentional about defining it and then crystallizing it so that people can see it in a very tangible way. Even color coded so that for those of us who like that sort of thing. So thank you. Those are my comments. Go ahead.
You all know that I have something to say.
Yeah.
A couple things that you said. You said meaningful accountability. You also said drive improvement. And so what that says to me is that this district does not settle. We don't settle for average. We don't settle for expecting students, because to me, the standardized test says, hey, can you memorize this? And then can you spit it back out, on this day? But that's not what we're looking for. And you talk about the different types of intelligence, and just acknowledging that people have all these different types of intelligence, and that we're actually looking for those and helping the students, figure out what their intelligence is, what their strengths are. I think that says a lot. And I do hope that this does get some sort of accreditation in the future. This would be fantastic for the state of Texas if there was more, that school districts could strive for, and if all the districts would start asking these. Some of these are really hard questions. I mean, and just to speak to the process, I know you guys have heard me talk about it some, but it was not easy. It was not an easy process, and there were some really heartfelt and hard conversations that were had during this time. And I applaud the district and the community members and the teachers and administrators that all were a part of this, because there was a lot of thought that went into every single time that we met, every single meeting.
Every single word.
Every single word, yes. And we didn't always agree. We didn't leave, agreeing on everything. But bottom line was that everyone that was a part of this, I think, realized that we're searching for more, and that this district is holding themselves to a much higher standard, which I thoroughly appreciate. And I mean, it's been an honor for me to get to be a part of this, and just to watch it unfold, and to watch you guys work and, do your magic. So, well, I think it's great, and I love that you're taking this on. And I tell everybody that this is one of the things that I love about this school district, is that this is a focus, and that it does look at all the sides of a student, not just one. We're not just trying to make straight A students, just like you said, Jeff. We're not just trying to make students that can, make good grades. That's not the focus. I mean, we're actually looking at, are they involved? Are they going to give back to the community? Are they going to be involved? How involved? Just all those different things. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think one of the things that really, I know academics is academics, but I think one of the ones that really touched me was on the safety and well-being. Mm-hmm. When you start looking at some of the stuff that we've done this last year, whether it's EpiPens or drug testing, I mean, a lot of those have, I think, resonate to me besides the academic thing. And
Thank you.
Okay, one more. I think part of it, and this goes back, I guess the roots of it were when I was first getting involved with, I'll say the district, I think it was planning for growth. Does that sound right?
Or long-range educational planning.
It was one of those two. Mm-hmm. It was a long time ago, though. And there was I forgot the gentleman's name, but he was a professor at A&M, and he had a bunch of statistics about, the long and the short of it was, the jobs we were preparing these kids for don't exist today. And he had the stats on the main jobs that are around today didn't exist 15 years ago. And so it was really kind of a neat thing to think about. And it, when you're in the business of educating students, it's fairly profound. And that if you're not forward thinking, if you're just thinking, well, when I was in high school, we did algebra like this, and we took this test, and everything was fine. That how limiting that really is, and how it constrains the ability of the students to expand their thinking and adapt and be ready for the future that we know is coming, but we don't know what it is. That's one of the things I really like about it, and as the engine model I really like. It's how it's an evolving thing, and you keep recalibrating it, and it's kind of that feedback loop, so that these students can get there. I mean, it's still, as I look, with planning for a student that I have now that's starting college and helping him go through that process. Well, all those things are important. Working collaboratively, I mean, that's huge, and how much of a focus we have on that. Making sure that they are involved and engaged and good community members. I mean, that's just the reality of today's world. And I applaud the effort and how forward-looking it is, but also how dynamic and engaging it is for the students, so that they can be prepared for that future that's coming that we don't know what it is.
I'm just reminded of, like Ms. Nolan said, why I love this district. And before we moved here, I remember, this is crazy. I remember going to a third grade parent meeting, the second, third week of school. And my son was in third grade at the time, and the basketball coach from the high school sat next to me. His son was in his class. And I said, "Hey, how's Matthew like the first few weeks of school?" He said, "Oh, he's so stressed." I said, "What? He's third grade. What are you stressed about? Lunch?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, they got to take the STAR test." And his son literally was not sleeping at night because he was going to have to take the STAR test in 6 or 7 months. And having worked in that district, I know what the focus was. And I mean, we wouldn't even talk about it with our kids because we didn't want them to turn into that. And then we moved here, and the focus has always been, since we've been here for 7, 8 years, it's always been on the student. It hasn't been on the test. And talking to so many of the teachers, I know it's a freeing environment for them as well. And I think it's just getting better. Thank you.
Appreciate that. I just like to say that this is a lot of work, and this doesn't happen by accident. It happens because there's a clear direction and a clear vision that's cast, and it's cast by the Board of Trustees. So from our table over here, we want to thank you for giving us the freedom to do this, the encouragement to be able to go out and try. We're going to try, and we're going to do well. We're going to fail some in this. We're going to skin our knee. We're going to get up, and we're going to improve this. This right here is not the end. This is the first try. And it's going to get better and better as we continue to see this system evolve. And I just want to say a very heartfelt thank you on behalf of the administration and personally for giving us the ability to do this, especially for Mrs. Perry, myself, Dr. Trammell, to be able to be involved in these other districts through TPAC. As iron sharpens iron, we get better through work with our cohorts around the state. And I just want to say a very special thank you to Mrs. Perry, who really is the tip of the spear for our work in doing this. And she's done a tremendous job in getting us organized and get our community group together and moving the district forward in this particular endeavor. So thank you.
Great, absolutely. Thank you.
And as always, great PowerPoint slide presentation.
Okay, item C3, consideration, discussion, and possible action related to the Birth to 5 Head Start Governance, Leadership, and Oversight Capacity Screener for the 2019-20 school year. Dr. Ely.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Members of the board, Dr. Trammell is joining us up here at the table to take us through a brief presentation on what we need to submit to the Office of Head Start for this year for our governance, leadership, and oversight capacity screener. This is a 17-question document. We want to give you a little bit of insight as to where we think we are on this. And Mr. Harris, this is an action item at the end, so we would be looking for a motion and approval at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'd like to throw it over to Dr. Penny Trammell, our Chief Academic Officer. Dr. Trammell.
Good evening. First of all, it's good news that we're here to look at this governance screener. This means that we
start.
have received our 5-year grant for the Early Head Start program. This affects many students in our district who wouldn't be able to afford to attend early education. We have 13 classes of Head Start, and you have graciously offered to serve as the governing body, so thank you for that. As a result of getting this new grant, we do need to fill out this screener and then have dialogue with our regional office to ensure that we have the strongest governance possible. So with that, I'd just like to go over the criteria for this screener and establishing that strong governance. There are 3 areas that we look at when scoring this screener. We either meet the criteria, we are set to meet it within the first 3 months of funding, or we need assistance. And by that just means we need to have dialogue with the regional office and get further clarification or their ideas and suggestions on how we would want to structure our program or our governance. There are, as Dr. Ely mentioned, 17 things that we look at. The first one, the governing body has the required composition. This really doesn't apply to us since we're a local school district and you all serve as the governing body. We don't necessarily have to have someone on the board that has expertise in early childhood because we have a whole department who has expertise in early childhood. So some of those criteria are automatically met as part of being a local school district. The second criteria is that the policy council has the correct composition, and it does. The third one is that it ensures that the governing body nor the policy council committee at the delegate level have a conflict of interest. That would mean conflicts with us operating efficiently and you doing your due diligence and governance of the funding and that kind of thing with the program. A parent committee with the correct composition of parents has been established. We would like to mark needs assistance in understanding this because there's 2 options here and we would like to confer to see which would be in the best interest of the district. One is a center-based option, which could mean that we establish that at the local level, which would be at the campus level, which is called the center level where the actual classrooms are located, or at the local program level, which would be at the district level. So we want to just confer and see the pluses and minuses of the 2 options and get their
So do we need to have a
advice.
parent group committee at every school, or do we need to have one centrally that represents all of Head Start? And that's the
We're
conversation we
currently
need to have.
doing the one central.
We are. 5 is the governing body may establish an advisory committee as it deems necessary for effective governance and improvement. We don't feel that really applies because we have people in the district that maintain that for you all. The governing body receives effective and ongoing training and technical assistance to ensure that you all understand the information you receive and are able to provide effective oversight. We do that training several ways. When we have a new board member, we tend to do a one-on-one training with that board member. It lasts anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. We also provide training at board meetings and through the transmittal. So we have a variety of ways that we do that. The Policy Council receives effective and ongoing training. That's evidenced on our agendas. And we also have a board representative. Ms. Green is our representative this year. And she is aware of that training as it happens as well and can debrief the board with her reports to the board on that training. The governing body exercises their responsibilities of establishing criteria for recruiting, selecting, and enrolling children, selecting policy council members, and reviewing applications and amendments for funding. That's on the board agenda almost, every single month, and you all do approve that criteria for weighting of who we accept and how we screen out the children that do qualify. The governing body exercises their responsibilities in the areas of operating budget and approval of major financial expenditures of the agency. And again, you do that monthly. Also, in keeping the lines open, you have reports in the transmittal on budgetary items. You are engaged in approving the annual self-assessment, the agency's progress in carrying out the programmatic and physical provisions in the grant application and personnel policies, and the results from monitoring conducted and any follow-up activities needed. Sharon has in the past given the yearly self-assessment report, so you all do hear that and have an opportunity to give input and feedback into that, so we do meet that criteria. The program staff ensures that the parent committee assumes responsibility in working with the staff in developing and implementing local program policies, activities, services. It has a process for communication with the policy council and committees, and participates in the recruitment and screening of employees. We put set to meet because there is an exception that we would like to confer with the regional office on, and that would be in the parents actually being on committees where we interview employees and hire employees. They could certainly have input into the attributes of great teachers, to work with kids and that kind of thing, but we really tend to use our district HR department for that. So we would just like to confer with them to make sure that that's appropriate and that we are in alignment on that. So that would be another area we would like to confer on. We also meet the 12th criteria, which is the Head Start program works with the governing body and policy council to make available to the public a report published at least once a year that discloses all of these things, really the children and the families served, the percent of children enrolled that receive medical and dental exams, efforts to prepare kids for kindergarten, a summary of the program's most recent community assessment, any information required that the secretary of the governing body might request of us, we present to you all. An annual financial audit and self-assessment, and really this is included under Mr. Martindale's area. It's part of the annual audit, so we're definitely covered in that area. 14, the governing body and policy council have jointly established written procedures for resolving internal disputes between the governing board and the policy council in a timely manner that includes impasse procedure. And should that, we do have that in writing, and should that not be effective, then a mediator would be selected between the policy council and the governing body that is mutually agreed upon, and their decision would be final. So that would be if the policy council would vote for one thing and you all would come back and go, nah, I don't think so. That's, we want to do it this way, then there could be some mediation required. We meet that. The policy council approves and submits to the governing body decisions about budget planning, applications for funding and amendments, program recruitment, selection, enrollment priorities, bylaws. You all approve those yearly. You approve all of these things yearly. So this is like when we go to present for extra funding for the grant, you all approve us even applying for that funds, and then you approve us actually applying. So we meet this criteria easily. And then the program must submit reports as appropriate to the Health and Human Services official or department immediately or as soon as practical as required. So should they require or request any documents, we would need to submit those to them immediately. So this is just a requirement of us re-upping on the grant and getting awarded the grant officially. We just need to be sure that we have a strong governing body, which we feel we do have. We would like to, on the next slide, consult in these two areas, a clarification on the parent committees, and then with the personnel policies and the Head Start requirements with parents having, voice in the hiring of personnel. So those are the two areas that we would come to you for approval on submitting to the regional office for consultation and advice on. At this point, before we ask for a motion, do you have any questions or additional suggestions or anything that would go along with that?
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Questions?
Okay. So with that then, we would like to seek the board's approval to present this screener to the Head Start Regional Office as presented for dialogue and discussion. And so we just need a motion and a second.
I make a motion that we approve the screener as presented.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed? Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you so
very
much.
much. Item C4, consideration, discussion, and possible action related to TASB Board Policy Update 113. Dr. Ely.
Thank you, Mr. Harris, members of the board. Texas Association of School Boards, our policy analyst, and they do updates from time to time for the school district. This is a fairly substantial update that we would be seeking your approval for at the August meeting. We have this here on the agenda simply if there's some questions or clarifications that you would like for us to be able to share with you, to talk about that with us at this time. Also, please know that you can contact me at any time should you need any further information for us to get to the rest of the board members prior to taking this to a vote in August. So is there anything that you would like us to be getting further information on?
I have a note written down in my notes, but I don't know. I can't remember what it was. So I'm going to have to read through them again and get back to you.
Okay.
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 Anyone? Okay, with that, we are adjourned and we will be back at 7
7 o'clock.
p.m.
Thank you.